Hey, vinyl community. Elliot here, Lazy Dogs Records, and Brandon at Mr. Hall of Fame has a thread that he started called Push the Button. And if you know on DISCOGS, if you have your record collection in there, entered in the database, beside the search bar, there's a little place that says random selection. And if you hit that button, it will pull up somewhere from your collection randomly a record. And so the premise of this, of course, is to do that 10 times and let's see what records pop up. Let's see how eclectic your collection is. My collection's all LPs. I don't have any of the CDs entered in there. And I've got about 3,600, and I think it's like 3,630 some entered in there, with some still to be entered, but most of my collection is in there now. So here we go. There were two records that I couldn't find. They're here somewhere, obviously, but I couldn't find them. So I did it two more times. So I'll mention the ones I couldn't find and then show you the ones that replaced them. All right, the Untitled Led Zeppelin album came up. This is a 1977 pressing. I believe this was my friend Ken's record, who gave me his collection a couple of years ago. And what do you say about Led Zeppelin? Uh, Everybody, this is probably one of the most talked about albums in the vinyl community. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. It's a great album, but I'm not going to go on and on about it. Okay. The second one I came up with was the Tony Rice unit Manzanita. Now, Tony Rice, of course, the amazing acoustic guitarist who passed away a couple 3 years ago now. Unlike much of the roots oriented music that you can acquire used, most of those recordings are not expensive records at all. Tony Rice is the exception. The various Tony Rice albums out there command a lot of money. So if you're out there crate digging and maybe you don't know that much about this genre, but if you're out there crate digging and you come upon some Tony Rice records, pay attention and go ahead and get these. For instance, I filled in all the holes in my collection. I had probably 2/3 of Tony Rice's discography, and I filled in most. I'm sure there's a couple I'm still missing, but for the most part, I've filled in all this major releases on Rounder and Flying Fish and County and the different labels he recorded for. And I ended up about 4 years ago, I ended up paying over $85 for this, $85 and some cents when shipping and tax were added to this. So that's how, these are valuable records. Usually when it says the Tony Rice unit, when they call the band the unit, you're talking about a jazz-oriented acoustic music. Uh, you won't hear banjos in it. You'll hear uh, violins. You'll hear guitars. You'll hear mandolins mainly, and it's kind of in line with what we might hear from have heard in the past from uh, Stefan Grappelli and Django Reinhardt, people like that. But on this particular album, it is more the traditional folk type music uh, that he often does, but usually not under the moniker the Tony Rice Unit. Old Train's on here, the great Norman Blake song, Ginseng Sullivan's on here. Uh, it's 9 Pound Hammer is even on here. Uh, Blackberry Blossom traditional song is on here. Uh, Manzanita is a Tony Rice composition. That will be more like what we usually hear from Tony Rice Unit. But anyway, great album. Highly recommend. This was in 1979, I believe, and this was on Rounder. you're familiar with the Rounder label. That's one of the labels you would see on Rounder from that period, around late 70s into the 80s. Okay. And the third record is Yosef Lateef from 1972 on Atlantic Records. And this is called The Gentle Giant. And he is playing a lot of flute on this album. I didn't know much about Yosef Lateef, but remember a few years ago when the big FOMO was over, I believe it was called Eastern Passages, album that had been repressed, remastered, repressed, and put out as a an audio file recording, and everybody was scared they were going to miss it and everything like that. I avoided that particular album because I wasn't going to pay those exorbitant prices, especially because I didn't know much about the artist. But what I oftentimes do when something like that occurs and you get some fear of missing out and interest in an artist, I'll go in and look for things around that release from that artist. The album that came immediately before, a couple albums before, or a couple albums after, and can pick those up for a pretty good price, usually. And that's what I did here. Okay. And the next was Terry Reid's self-titled album. Could not find that Save My Life. But, of course, a British artist, Mickey Most, produced a lot of his work until they had a falling out. And he's, of course, whenever you mention Terry Reid, people mention the fact that when the Yardbirds had disbanded and they were going to reform as a band, put together a band to fulfill some tour dates as the new Yardbirds, Terry Reid was asked to be the vocalist for them. He declined because he already had previous engagements contracted for some tours, opening for some other acts, and recommended Robert Plant. There's your Terry Reid story. How many people have heard that? I mean, half of you were going, why is he telling us this? Everybody tells this story. Okay, the next one was Cal Smith, a country singer. I've got an album somewhere from 1972. I found Someone of My Own, which as I said, from 1972. He was a California musician who, in early 60s, Ernest Tubb hired him to be in his band, and he can be heard on many, many Ernest Tubb recordings from the 1960s. In the late 60s, he went on his own, got a contract, and that was his first hit, was his title track from this album. He had a number one on another song on this album, but his big hit came in 1974. One of my favorite country songs, Country Bumpkin. And, a lot of people say, oh, that's so corny. That's so, they're tapping into your heartstrings. It's just not, they're just, it's hokey or whatever, Or I love it. I love it. There's nothing wrong with tugging on your heartstrings. And that song just does it for me. I love it. Country Bumpkin. Okay. Then you remember the band, the Blasters, Phil Alvin and I forget his brother's name, but they do some duo stuff today. Well, this is not them. This is another band from a couple of decades earlier, 1963 album on Crown Records. Now, this is Sounds of the Drags, the Blasters. Totally fictitious band formed in the studio. Crown Records, as a lot of you know, was a discount record label, and they threw stuff together and sold mainly in places like grocery stores and five and dimes and things like that at a very cut rate, discounted price. But there's some gems in there. But this is a quirky little unique album that I picked up many years ago. And going right back to Crown once again, believe it or not, guess what pops up? Another Crown record. This is the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers, Bluegrass Favorites. They decided they were going to put out Crown decided they were going to put out a bluegrass record to capitalize, I guess, on, Flat and Shrug's popularity at that time. And so there were only 2 or 3 bluegrass bands in the whole state of California at that point. So they got these guys, the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers, and they got them in studio, and in less than a day they had an album. I probably didn't do 1 or 2 takes on any of them, and they said they finished in the studio. They went outside and walked over to a park, took a picture in the park, and there's your cover. And they had that stuff, this record pressed and out the door in no time. But the interesting thing about that, some people that would go on, this young mandolin player, I believe he was 17 at the time. I may be wrong about that. I can misremember things pretty easily. This is Chris Hillman, who would go on and join the Byrds as the bassist. He was a mandolin player. They asked him, "Can you play the bass?" And he said, "Of course I can." He couldn't. He never played bass before. Went and borrowed a bass real quick, got somebody to show him, some of the basics. And he became the bass player and vocalist, one of the vocalists for the Byrds. And then go on, Flying Burrito Brothers, Desert Rose Band, so on. Individual records under his own name, Chris Hillman. So there's Chris Hillman. The banjo player is Wirtz. I believe I can't call his first name right now, and I'm probably butchering his last name. He'd go on and be a member of the Country Gazette, which is a really good bluegrass band a few years later, and also a member of the Flying Burrito Brothers in one of their later forms after Chris Hillman had left. And the next thing that came up, David Allan Coe. This is Rough Rider from 1972. This is the album that came out during his prime when he was really hitting stride. We can say a lot of negative things about David Allan Coe, but I'm just going to say positive things. This man, when he was on in a club setting, he can put on the best show you've ever seen in your life. I mean, back during that time, he was one great performer when he was on. Now, he could be off sometime, but when he was on, it was great. Wrote some good, excellent songs in his lifetime, picked some excellent songs to written by other artists, and stole some songs from some people. But David Allan Coe still alive today. I'm not going to go see him today if he were playing anywhere. Shadow of himself. He's in his mid to late 80s now. Okay. Jimmy McCracklin. This is my answer on Imperial. I believe it's Imperial. Yeah, Imperial Records. And this is a West Coast blues and R&B album from '66, I believe. Interesting artist. Spent most of his time on the West Coast, originally from the Midwest. And then jazz album, Clifford Brown. I really like Clifford Brown and Geller and Max Roach, of course. I always like how they'll reissue jazz records, and it doesn't matter who the main artist was on a recording. If one of the artists that was a side man on the recording is hot right now, a bigger name, they'll put it down under their name. Now, I don't know whose recordings these were actually for, but it's Clifford Brown, of course, on trumpet, and Herb Geller on alto sax, Max Roach on drums, and Kenny Drew's on the piano, but they don't even mention that on here. It seems like they would add Drew too. This is a good album. I like this. And then I had to pull 2 more because I couldn't find those 2 I mentioned. And Bill Withers, Making Music, Making Friends. This is not a Vinyl Me Please, Music on Vinyl reissue from 2020, I believe. I love Bill Withers. What a great songwriter. I call him a singer-songwriter. In fact, when I went looking for him, I have my records separated by genre. I couldn't remember whether I had them under R&B, soul, singer-songwriter, and rock. I found them in R&B soul. And finally, the last one I'll show you is Phil Alvin, the previously mentioned Blasters, not the one on Crown, but remember the Blasters. Phil Alvin's solo album. This is very much a roots album. It's called Unsung Stories. And interestingly enough, it features Sun Ra, the jazz, the quirky, strange jazz guy. This is very much it's country blues. It's Louisiana feeling music. It's the Dirty Dozen Brass Band is on some of this. Uh, and it's just got a little bit of everything, and it is on Slash Records. Y'all know Slash. It's from '86. So that's what I was able to pull up, and fun thread. I hope others will do it. And I'll just remind all of you to remember to be kind to your neighbors, folks, because we're all neighbors.